For 3 interminable days, James Carter was held captive by a headache of such brutal intensity that he was convinced his skull was physically cracking open. It was a pain that defied all conventional remedies, a relentless pounding agony that made a mockery of over-the-counter painkillers and turned the sanctuary of a dark, quiet room into just another chamber of torment. The world had shrunk to the confines of his own throbbing head. And just when he believed the suffering had reached its absolute peak, a new, more terrifying dimension was revealed. His wife Laura, her face etched with a concern that had been deepening by the hour, reached out and pressed her cool fingers gently to his fevered forehead. The touch was meant to soothe, but what happened next was pure horror. She felt a distinct undulating movement beneath the skin, a subtle shifting that was utterly alien. In that single chilling moment, the comforting illusion of a severe migraine shattered, and James knew with a cold, sinking certainty that this was something else entirely, something alive. James had only recently returned from a demanding 2-week business trip to Brazil, where his work had taken him to the fringes of the vast Amazon rainforest. The trip had been a grind of long meetings with local contractors, navigating treacherous, rain-slicked roads that seemed to swallow tires whole, and a constant, futile battle against clouds of persistent mosquitoes. He was a seasoned traveler, accustomed to the dull ache of jet lag, the gritty fatigue of sleepless nights in unfamiliar hotel rooms, and the general discomfort that comes with crossing time zones. He had initially written off the first signs of discomfort to this familiar cycle of exhaustion. The pain had begun subtly enough, a dull, persistent throb deep behind his left eye that he attributed to eye strain from reading reports on a flickering screen. But by the second night back in the deceptive safety of his own home, the throb had blossomed into a full-blown, incapacitating agony. It was no longer a simple ache. It was a visceral sensation, as if a hot knife were being methodically jabbed and twisted into the side of his head. The very skin on his forehead seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and each beat of his heart echoed like a deafening drumbeat against the inner walls of his skull. He tried to rationalize it, clinging to the familiar. He forced down liters of water, suspecting dehydration. He swallowed ibuprofen, then acetaminophen, and, in his desperation, even combined them, ignoring the warnings on the labels. He lay perfectly still in the blackness of his bedroom, a cold compress clamped over his eyes, praying for silence. But the pain was impervious, a monstrous entity that fed on his attempts to quell it. By the dawn of the 3rd day, he was a ghost of himself, pacing the confines of his bedroom in the pre-dawn hours, his whispers of, "What the hell is this?" the only sound breaking the silence. A bizarre and terrifying sensation had begun to accompany the pain, a faint fluttering feeling, a ripple or a twitch deep beneath the skin of his forehead. He dismissed it as a trick of the mind, a hallucination born from pain and sleep deprivation. But the sensation was persistent, a nagging, wriggling truth that his rational mind refused to accept. Laura had watched his decline with growing alarm. Initially, she had fussed over him, bringing him water and a medication, believing he simply needed to sleep off the rigors of his travel. But by that 3rd morning, when James stumbled into the bright lights of the kitchen, his face a ghastly shade of pale, his eyes sunken into dark hollows, and his shirt soaked through with cold sweat, she knew this was a crisis. He gripped the kitchen counter as if it were the only thing tethering him to the earth, and in his eyes she saw not just pain, but a flicker of primal fear. "James," she said, her voice soft but firm, as she moved toward him cautiously. "You're scaring me. This isn't normal. You need to see a doctor. Now." He tried to wave her off, his hand gripping the back of a wooden chair until his knuckles were white. "I don't need a doctor," he insisted, his voice a ragged whisper. "I just need..." His sentence was severed by a fresh, searing wave of pain that shot through his scalp, so intense it drove him down into the chair, gasping for air. Seeing his resistance crumble, Laura moved with a new determination. "Let me check your head," she insisted. He offered a weak groan of protest, but acquiesced with a slight nod, thinking, what could she possibly find? Migraines don't leave bruises. Her fingers were gentle as they moved through his damp hair, probing his scalp. Then her touch stilled, and a moment later a short, sharp scream escaped her lips. James flinched violently. What is it?" Her voice dropped to a horrified whisper. "I felt a lump, and I swear to God, James, it moved." Driven by a surge of adrenaline and dread, James sprinted to the bathroom and yanked his head forward to stare into the mirror, pulling his hair back from his forehead. There it was, a small, inflamed, swollen bump, red and angry looking. He saw no movement, no visible twitch, just a lump. But the image of Laura recoiling, her hand flying to her mouth in horror, was burned into his mind. He pressed a tentative finger against the swelling, and the resultant explosion of pain was so instant and nauseating that he nearly vomited into the sink. Laura appeared in the doorway, her face as pale as parchment. "We're going to the hospital. Now." This time, James didn't argue. The abstract fear had crystallized into a terrifying possibility. The thought that something might be alive inside him, burrowing through the tissue of his head, was infinitely more frightening than any headache. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room hummed overhead, casting a sterile, unforgiving glow. Laura did all the talking, her words tumbling out in a rushed, anxious narrative as she explained the 3 days of escalating pain, the strange swelling, and the unmistakable movement. James sat slumped in a plastic chair, silent, focusing all his energy on simply remaining conscious. Dr. Grayson, a tall, sharp-eyed physician with a calm demeanor, listened intently before donning a pair of gloves to examine the lump himself. His touch was clinical and precise. "You say this started 3 days ago?" he asked, his fingers probing the area. James could only manage a weak nod. "It feels like something is chewing through my skull," he mumbled. The doctor's questions then took a specific turn. "Have you traveled recently?" "Yeah," James said. "Brazil." The Amazon region. The effect of those words on Dr. Grayson was instantaneous and profound. His professional calm tightened into something more urgent. "Any insect bites? Mosquitoes?" "A few," James replied. "Nothing major." The usual. Dr. Grayson didn't respond. Instead, he muttered a quick, sharp order to a nurse and turned back to James. "We need to run a CT scan. Immediately. Just to be safe." 30 minutes later, Dr. Grayson was staring at the ghostly gray images of James Carter's head on a computer monitor. The initial cursory glance showed nothing overtly wrong. No bleeds, no obvious masses, but something nagged at him, a subtle anomaly. He zoomed in on the area of the forehead, enhancing the contrast, and there it was. Just beneath the skin, nestled within the subcutaneous tissue, was a long, slender, worm-like shadow, a foreign body that had no business being there. The reality of what he was seeing hit Dr. Grayson with physical force. He stood up so quickly, his wheeled chair shot backward, and toppled over with a clatter. He rushed back to the examination room, his heart hammering against his ribs. Without a word, he pushed James's hair aside and pressed his gloved fingers around the lump once more. This time, he felt it. A distinct muscular contraction, a twitch beneath his fingertips. His stomach lurched. He yanked his hand away as if burned. "Oh, God, no," he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of revulsion and urgency. He turned to the nurse, his tone now commanding. prep for minor surgery. Now, James struggled to sit up. What is it? Dr. Grayson swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Mr. Carter, there's something living under your skin. We need to get it out. Immediately. Minutes later, James was lying flat on a procedure table, the cold vinyl sticking to his back. A tray of gleaming, sterilized surgical instruments sat beside him, looking ominously sharp. Laura had been allowed to stay sitting in a corner chair, her hands clenched together so tightly her knuckles were white, her breathing shallow. Dr. Grayson administered a local anesthetic around the lump. Whatever this is, it's very close to the surface, he explained, his voice steady despite the circumstances. You shouldn't feel any pain, but you must, and I cannot stress this enough, stay perfectly still. James nodded, a cold sweat pooling in the hollow of his neck. The first incision was small and precise. As the scalpel pierced the skin, the lump beneath twitched violently, a grotesque independent spasm. Laura gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dr. Grayson pressed down gently around the area with his fingers. A thin stream of clear fluid and blood leaked from the wound. He carefully widened the cut with a pair of retractors, and then it happened. Something moved. A thick, pale, segmented body squirmed into view, pulsating with a vile, alien life. "Oh my God," the assisting nurse whispered, taking an involuntary step back. Dr. Grayson himself nearly fumbled the forceps. "It's trying to burrow back in," he said, a note of panic in his voice for the first time. "Suction." Now, James, who had been staring at the ceiling, clenched his fists. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice strained. "What's inside me?" Dr. Grayson didn't answer. He focused entirely on the task, his movements becoming more desperate. He managed to clamp the forceps around the creature, and with a final firm tug, there was a wet popping sound as the thing slid free. It landed in the stainless steel tray with a soft, sickening thud. There it lay, writhing and twitching, its pale, glistening body coiling and uncoiling. A large, fat, fully grown botfly larva. The sight was too much for James. He turned his head, vomited once, and then passed out cold. When James awoke, the world had changed. The oppressive, soul-crushing pain that had been his constant companion for 3 days was simply gone, replaced by a dull, manageable throbbing from the stitches on his forehead. He sat with Laura in Dr. Grayson's office, his hands still trembling slightly, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders as if he were cold to the bone. Dr. Grayson entered, holding a clear, sealed specimen jar. Floating in a solution inside was the creature now still. "I believe it's a Dermatobia hominis," the doctor said, his voice weary. "A human botfly larva. The female botfly captures a mosquito and lays her eggs on it. When that mosquito bites a human, the body heat triggers the eggs to hatch, and the larvae enter through the bite wound." James stared at the jar, speechless. It was one thing to hear the words. It was another to see the proof. The thing that had been living inside his head, slowly feeding on him. Laura found her voice first, a hushed, disbelieving whisper. That was inside his head?" Dr. Grayson nodded grimly. "Usually they remain in the subcutaneous skin layer. It is extremely, extremely rare for one to migrate and embed so close to the skull. If it had managed to go deeper toward the bone, you could have developed a severe intracranial infection, meningitis. The consequences could have been catastrophic." James wiped a trembling hand over his face. "So, I had a parasite." "Living in my head for weeks, we think," Dr. Grayson confirmed, offering a tired, sympathetic smile. "Yes, and you are incredibly lucky you came in when you did. That thing was feeding and growing. It would have only gotten worse." 2 weeks later, James sat on the front porch of his home, the evening air cool on his skin. He held a cold beer that he didn't really taste, and his free fingers traced the fading stitch scar on his forehead. The physical wound was healing cleanly, but the memory of the ordeal was still fresh and raw, a psychological scar that ran much deeper. He had not yet returned to work, and the mere thought of booking another flight, let alone one that would take him near a jungle, made his stomach clench with a visceral dread. Laura sat beside him, her hand covering his, a silent gesture of solidarity. In the days following the surgery, she had cleaned the house with a frantic, almost ritualistic intensity, as if trying to scrub away the very memory of the event. She still checked his head every morning, her touch gentle but searching, a quiet vigilance born of trauma. They didn't talk about it often. Words seemed inadequate to capture the horror, but their shared silence spoke volumes. James leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes against the setting sun, and whispered the thought that haunted him most. If you hadn't checked. If we'd waited even one more day. Laura squeezed his hand tighter, her grip firm and reassuring. But we didn't, she said softly, and for the first time in weeks, a genuine, weary smile touched James's lips. The idea was still almost incomprehensible. A human botfly hiding inside someone's forehead, masquerading as a simple headache. It was a truth so bizarre and terrifying that it needed a moment to truly sink in. The doctor's final warning echoed in his mind. Had James waited even one more week, this story could have ended very differently. A cautionary tale about the hidden dangers that can lurk in the most ordinary of ailments. It was a stark reminder that when a pain doesn't feel quite right, when it defies all logic and remedy it, is sometimes a signal of something far more sinister, a reason to look deeper than the medicine cabinet. That's all about our stories. Do you have any thoughts after hearing the story? Please share it in the comments below.